One thing that you should know, World War I, it brought us into the modern era.
And today, we live in the world that World War I shaped.
For Americans in particular, it brought Americans firmly into the 20th century and into a global mindset.
You can see that in technology, the development of planes. You can see that in social movements, women's equal rights, the civil rights movement.
Suddenly, one worker in an industrialized nation could produce what hundreds of workers were needed to produce in the 18th century and the early 19th century. This gave an advantage to nations in building ships, in exploiting technology, in changing the way that things were done, both intellectually and physically.
It's the 20th century. It's a whole new ballgame from the 19th century.
The one thing that people should know about World War I, probably the toll that it takes in terms of what happens with death counts after the war that are really complicated by the influenza, the spread of germs. And a lot of times we don't think about the impact of the war after the war.
It's uncertain of where the first case of the flu took place, although recent studies seem to indicate that an Army training camp in Kansas is where. And then all of a sudden it spread like wildfire across the United States and impacted major cities. Everyone knew someone who was impacted by the flu. Problem was, there weren't enough doctors to handle this.
So how do you care for those that have died, but also those that are incapacitated? And what is the trajectory of disease in the aftermath of war? And those are things that typically we don't associate with World War I, but are really actually very important.
The one thing that people should know about World War I was how unbelievably violent it was. World War I was by far the bloodiest war that Europe had experienced in centuries.
The Battle of the Somme, probably the most famous battle that the British troops were involved in, July 1st, 1916. It's 19,000 soldiers were killed in a single day. It's astronomical to think about that figure. These were young men who, of course, didn't come home. They didn't get married. They didn't have children. And a whole generation of British life was lost on a single battle.
What made the First World War a modern war was the way that it mobilized whole societies, and not just mobilized them as laborers and farmers, but also made whole societies targets. This is the first time that you see sort of mass targeting of civilian populations as well as soldiers. And I think that's what makes the First World War distinctive and distinctively modern.